This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Did you know that most vitamin D3 supplements come from sheep's wool? I'm Kat, founder of Ritual. We're making traceability the new standard for the supplement industry. When I was pregnant, I couldn't find a multivitamin I could trust, so I created my own. Ours is made traceable, third-party tested, and clean label project certified. Oh, and our vitamin D3? It comes from sustainably harvested lichen from England, not sheep. Trace for yourself with 25% off at ritual.com/podcast.
We made this.
Hi, this is Dean Haglund. I'm Langley from The X-Files, and you're listening to The X-Cast.
Welcome back, everyone, to the X-Cast. The truth is in here. I am your guest host for this episode, Tony Black, and I'm back because we're currently in the middle of what was originally planned to be a Lone Gunmen summer, but for various reasons, including the 30th anniversary celebrations of the X-Files in September, we've shunted it back to be a Lone Gunmen fall, let's put it that way. And as you'll be listening, you'll have heard episodes where we've gone back over things like Unusual Suspects and Three of a Kind. But we've got there at long last. We are talking about the 13-episode TV show spin-off, The Lone Gunmen. And who better to join me for this odyssey than the man who's been around since almost as long as we've been doing the X-Casts as the Lone Gunmen were in the X-Files, Darren Mooney. How are you today?
I'm great, and I'm glad to be a part of Lone Gunmen Summer, which sounds like it's a weird fashion trend where we all wear Ramon t-shirts and let our hair grow long and occasionally cover ourselves in blue paint. I'm here for it. I do like the idea that 3 episodes make a summer, by the way. It's like
yeah. Well, aside from the blue paint, that sounded very both 90s and 60s all rolled into one, what you were describing then, which is possibly quite appropriate for the Lone Gunmen, actually, because it is a weird old mashup of all of those different things. The best thing to do is, before we go in, what we're going to do in this episode is we're going to have a fairly loose chat about the show, go into what we think about it, go into some of the production stuff we know of. Not necessarily go through each episode one by one, because I don't think either you or I or we deserve that. So I think we'll just talk generally about it. And then we do have some feedback from the wonderful listeners in the X-Cast basement group
Tony,
at the end that we'll talk about.
Tony, I only agreed to do this because we were going to spend 40 minutes talking about 3 men in a smoking diaper. That was the condition I signed on for.
Well, and a little bit of Ina Kleiner Frohike, surely.
And
well,
Diagnosis Jimmy and Maximum Buyers, all of which are movie episodes that I would totally remember, even if I wasn't just reading a note document that I had here.
I know, I've cheated you. I've cheated you out of it, haven't I, Darren? This could have been a 13-episode journey. Yeah. But alas, you'll have to make do with one, guys. So, The Lone Gunmen then. This obviously premieres in March of 2001. In the middle of the X-Files season 8, basically. And so right towards the end of the X-Files run. And this is 13 episodes focusing on the Lone Gunmen, Frohike, Melvin Frohike, Richard Langley, and John Fitzgerald Byers. And it's very much off the back of those X-Files episodes that focused on those characters in the past primarily. But here they get their own show, and it is a different beast from both the X-Files and Millennium, but created by and written by much of the same team. So, you know, aside from Chris Carter overseeing everything, Vince Gilligan, John Scheiben, Frank Spotnitz, etc., they're all involved. So it's within the wheelhouse of 1013 and everything they're doing at this point. So it feels like a natural third show, I guess, for them to, or second show, should we say, after the X-Files that they should have a run at. But Darren, what do you make of it overall, generally, before we dig into a little bit of the detail?
Well, the context of it is really, really strange because it's like the Lone Gunmen spin-off, you're quite right, it does seem like the most logical spin-off for the X-Files. The question, of course, is why are you doing it in March 2001? Why is this the, third show that Carter has launched after the X-Files, following on from Millennium and following on from the crashing and the burning of Harsh Realm? Why is it only now that you're getting to the Lone Gunmen? Surely the point to launch this would have been, at the height of the X-Files' success, back in, say, the fourth season, for example. In fact, the fourth season would arguably been the perfect place for a number of reasons. You had the movie coming out soon. You had, the Lone Gunmen being involved in stories like Music of a Cigarette Smoking Man, for example, but also Memento Mori, which went on and, was nominated for an Emmy, won Gillian Anderson her Emmy, for example. You even have things
Funky
like
Poaching.
Which is a major influence here. I don't know if you watch the episodes with the commentary, but there is quite literally, there's Funky Poaching in Diagnosis Jimmy. And there is, a reference to the Funky Poaching in the final episode of the season, which is All About Eve's. Where,
About Eve.
Yeah, where I think Frank Spotnitz has said that they were specifically inspired by Memento Mori. But it really does feel like that would have been the perfect time to launch it. And you also obviously have then the X-Files kind of moving two Sunday nights and therefore vacating the Friday night slot. And what better thing to put in the slot that the X-Files had been in than the Lone Gunmen, while having the X-Files also as a blockbuster on Sunday nights. It just feels really strange that that would have been the perfect moment to launch the show when it was at the height of its popularity. And instead you get it in the middle of the 8th season, where the only reason that an 8th season of The X-Files exists is because literally every other show on Fox, apart from The Simpsons, had been cancelled. The disastrous season that Fox had in 1999 under Doug Herzog, where The X-Files just kind of limped into an 8th season, despite the complete absence or large absence of David Duchovny, who was at that time suing Fox and Chris Carter and creating all manner of kind of legal difficulties where, it didn't really seem like Fox were particularly excited to have the X-Files around at all at that moment in time. So it's kind of surreal that was the point at which they said, you know what? Now is the time in the culture when finally people are ready for a direct spin-off of the X-Files. And and to be clear, the reason why it didn't happen at the show's peak is because Carter was not really particularly interested in doing it. He obviously, Millennium, we talked about that. There's an entire separate podcast discussing that. But one of the big tensions with that was Carter wanting to keep the show separate from the X-Files, not wanting it to feel like a spin-off or a secondary or a satellite show of the X-Files, where you maybe had references like the stunt doubles appearing in the background of shots, but by and large, the X-Files and Millennium for its first season were kept mostly separate, and then obviously Morgan and Wong come along and it starts getting a bit more playful, experimental. Jose Chung pops over, for example. The cigarette-smoking man is implicitly a member of the Millennium group, and then obviously after Millennium is cancelled, it ends up getting folded back into the mothership through the episode Millennium. But by and large, you get a sense that Carter didn't want his only success story at Fox to be the X-Files, and so Harsh Realm and Millennium were kind of meant to be separate. And so this feels kind of weirdly desperate. And again, Carter's talked about how, his name is on the show as a creator. He's credited as a writer on the pilot episode, just called Pilot, which I'm sure we will talk about in depth. It is a very clever joke that ends up becoming deeply uncomfortable 6 months after the episode airs.
Right.
But Carter said, basically, look, this wasn't my show. It was Gilligan, Shiban, and Spotnitz who came to me and said, we want to do a Lone Gunmen spin-off off the back of that 6th season episode, Three of a Kind. People point to Unusual Suspects as the obvious, Lone Gunmen pilot episode. But it's really interesting that if you watch the show and you watch the commentary on the DVD box set, and if you are going to watch this show, and that's a very caveated if you are going to watch this show, but if you've decided you're going to watch this show, if you can find the Blu-ray box set, it is a wonderful collection. It includes a number of commentaries from cast and crew where they talk very candidly about the show and its development. But you have this idea that, basically, it was Gilligan, Shiban, and Spotnitz who came to him and said, we really want to do a Lone Gunmen show. We really want it to feel like Three of a Kind, which is an episode of the 6th season, which they seem to love. But I know that, In my experience, fans are like, it's fine, it's solid, it's not as good as Unusual Suspects. But I love that like Gilligan, Shaban, and Spotnitz were like, yeah, but let's just do that every week for like, I don't know, 5 or 6 seasons. But Tony, like, we were talking a little bit about this before we went on air, and then I kind of realized we should save it for the air. When you declared this Lone Gunmen Summer, when you put that line in the sand at the beach party where we're hosting Lone Gunmen Summer, you had not watched this show?
No.
You never felt curious?
I was curious for a long time, like, and actually quite hopeful, you know, and actually quite, because let's be honest, you know, you've summed it all very well there, but let's be honest, it hasn't been particularly well received over the years. You know, I haven't spent the last 20 years hearing people say, "Oh my God, Tony, you need to watch this. It's like Firefly. It was cancelled before its time. It's like Daybreak. It was cancelled before its time." I've not heard that from anybody. I don't quite understand why I didn't watch it, actually, because I was still watching The X-Files. You might recall this better than me, Darren, but can you remember it being on
Sky or
television
BBC?
in Europe? Like, did you watch it then in that way?
No, I had pretty much the same experience you did, except I did it earlier because of the project that I did where I just did every X-Files thing in the original one of the show. And it was like I got to the 8th season and it's like, well, I did Millennium while I was going along. I did Harsh Realm as I was going along. And look, Harsh Realm was not a pleasure cruise by any measure of the term. So it's like, if I can get through Harsh Realm, the Lone Gunmen should be a piece of cake. And look, I feel like we're being maybe a bit mean to it here. I don't want to give the impression that I think this is the worst show in the history of television or anything like that. But yeah, it is interesting how it is pretty much completely forgotten in a way that, you know, even Millennium, which is ostensibly a much less mainstream show, it's a show that, you know, is not available to watch in HD anywhere. The DVDs are out of print. You can't stream it online, but it has a much stronger cultural presence than this 13-episode TV show starring 3 supporting characters on one of the like most important TV shows to air during the 90s.
Yeah.
It's weird that it has nothing.
It is weird. I know, because you would think that this would have some greater cultural traction, if not, you know, beloved, but be one of those shows that people would go, oh, well, the X-Files had the Lone Gunmen spin-off, of course, but it just seems to have and I suspect it was partly down to when it aired, you know, and I think this is partly why maybe I didn't watch it, because I do remember watching the 8th and 9th seasons. Well, I tell a lie. I certainly watched the 8th season when that was out on Sky in the UK, but I don't think I watched all of 9 at the time, because there was one episode of the X-Files that I'd never seen.
Oh, which
was underneath in season 9.
Okay, well, like nobody told you to go see The Lone Gunmen, I can't imagine anybody told you that Underneath was like an unsung masterpiece that you had to get to.
No, absolutely. But what did make me laugh is when I put that in the group, I think it might have been Cathy G, somebody said, Tony, you probably did watch it, you probably just forgot. So this is probably true. But yeah, I think it could have been the fact that it was on at a time when I think generally there was a waning enthusiasm for this universe at this point, and that actually is part of what Vince Gilligan has said in retrospect about the show. You know, he said the failure of that show, and I use semi-finger quotes around the word failure because I enjoyed what we did with it. It doesn't really tell me much going forward, because so much of television, I really believe, comes down to timing. And he thinks that if it had happened, like you said, a few years earlier, it might well have clicked and resonated with people. But I suppose the interesting fact with that, though, is had they made it before the change from Vancouver to Los Angeles, they might have ended up making a different show, in the sense that the Lone Gunmen, yes, they were comic relief, sure, throughout the whole run of the X-Files, but it was only after season 6 that you ended up getting episodes like 3 of a Kind that were a little bit more rambunctious, a little bit more intentionally comedic. That's when you get people like Maurice Fletcher come in. And, you know, I love Michael McKean as Maurice Fletcher. And apparently Maurice Fletcher was going to become a regular in the 2nd season of Lone Gunmen.
If they could have afforded him.
More than likely, probably a regular guest star.
Yeah.
But I would have been all over that, because I always enjoy seeing him in it. But he is definitely a creation of the second, the after the Fight the Future era of the X-Files.
The X-Files light, without wanting to use the term pejoratively. Yeah.
Absolutely. He would never have cropped up in the pre-movie world of The X-Files. So it would have been a different show, Darren, surely. They would have made The Lone Gunmen maybe a little bit less knockabout and intentionally comedic if they'd done it earlier, right?
Two things, just to go back on that and to Gilligan's point about the show's timing being off, it is worth noting that, people like, say, Dean Hagland have made the point that, that Chris Carter was not beloved at Fox at the time, that he'd had the whole deal with Herzog the year before, and there'd been the whole situation with Harsh Realm, and he also had the famous $30 million Sweetheart production deal, and a sense that, like, Fox were not particularly happy with how that deal had turned out for them. And Hagland has argued that the show was very much a casualty of that. There's also the discussion that, like, this aired, as you said, in 2001, which was, ignoring all the stuff that would come afterwards. This was the boom of reality television, where you had, like, obviously Big Brother was on as well, but the big thing was Who Wants to Be a Millionaire was airing something like 4 nights a week on ABC, which is insane to think about. It's something that you could tell kids about and they just would not believe. That there was a time in American pop culture where Regis Philbin was hosting Who Wants to Be a Millionaire 4 nights a week, and millions of people were tuning in. They just could not get enough of it. But that was really cheap, and that was really affordable television, and there's a big argument that this strangled. This led to a kind of a stranglehold on television drama in general in this period. In the turn of the millennium, American pop culture, it was incredibly difficult to launch a new show. I mean, things that would become classics, like, say, 24, would go on. They'd launch later this year in 2001. Its first season was on the ropes. I remember watching that show during its first season and it having terrible ratings, and there being a debate about whether or not it would get greenlit for a second season. And then obviously it goes on and becomes one of the most influential shows of the 21st century. But I do think, like, that is kind of an interesting question to unpack, if, like, the Lone Gunmen's cancellation was, setting aside quality, and I want to be clear, it can be cancelled and be a good show, it can be renewed and be a bad show. It's a 4-quadrant thing. There's any number of possibilities. There's no moral or qualitative judgment there. I'm not saying that, it was good. It was a show cancelled before its time, like Firefly, as you pointed out. But I do think there is something interesting in, say, Spotnitz's observation, or maybe it's Siobhan's observation, that the show was performing. It began airing on Sunday nights. It aired in the slot after This Is Not Happening. Basically, the show, The X-Files, went on hiatus for a couple of weeks, and Lone Gunmen launched in that slot, which you could argue was a bad choice, because can you imagine being an X-Files fan, and it's like, you end on that shot of Scully holding Mulder's dead body, screaming screaming up at the sky in agony, and it's like, by the way, tune in for the next 4 weeks to watch the lovable adventures of these delightful scamps. It's maybe not reading the room right.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Spotnitz has made the point that when the X-Files came back with Dead Alive, they shunted the Lone Gunmen into the Friday Night Death slot, and in that Friday Night Death slot, it actually performed about as well as the first season the X-Files had. Now, Fox is obviously a very different network at this point. Its expectations are obviously very different as well, but it's kind of interesting to say that, this show performed about as well as the first season the X-Files did in the slot the first season the X-Files had, but it was never going to survive. I think Gilligan tells the joke about, is it the King of the Hill writing staff or kind of animation staff, which included a bring back the Lone Gunmen joke in an episode that they wrote and animated before the first episode of the Lone Gunmen aired, which I thought was really charming. But to your point there about, like, the question of, like,
did you know that most vitamin D3 supplements come from sheep's wool? I'm Kat, founder of Ritual. We're making traceability the new standard for the supplement industry. When I was pregnant, I couldn't find a multivitamin I could trust, so I created my own. Ours is made traceable, third-party tested, and clean label project certified. Oh, and our vitamin D3? It comes from sustainably harvested lichen from England, not sheep. Trace for yourself with 25% off at ritual.com/podcast. Did you know a 2018 study showed half of prenatal vitamins tested had unacceptable levels of heavy metals? I'm Kat, mother of 3 and founder of Ritual. When I was 4 months pregnant, I couldn't find a prenatal I could trust, so I created my own. Ours is made traceable, third-party tested for heavy metals, and recently earned the Purity Award from the Clean Label Project. But don't just take my word for it. Get 25% off at ritual.com/podcast.
Would it have been a different show if it came out in the first 5 seasons? I think it's important to stress that while you did have that X-Files light, and again, not a pejorative term, love much of that era of the show. I know that when you say that, people tend to get defensive about it. I don't. I love it. I think Triangle and Drive are like two of the best episodes the show ever did. I'm just using it as a technical definition. But when you get to that X-Files light era, the 8th season of the X-Files was very much a pushback against that. Like, the 8th season of the X-Files is not at all a similar beast to the previous 2 seasons, the post-movie seasons. And I think The Lone Gunmen does exist in contrast to that. I think The Lone Gunmen, and again, you could argue it's the shift to Vancouver versus the filming in Los Angeles, but that 8th season works really hard to recreate a lot of the Vancouver atmosphere in Los Angeles. There's a lot more night shooting. There's a lot more darkness. There's a lot more contrast. Episodes like Patience take place largely at night, which must have been a nightmare for anybody to try and shoot in Los Angeles. But I think that like the comedy of The Lone Gunmen kind of feels like a reaction against that, where Spotnitz and Shaban and Gilnitz are kind of looking at the show in its 8th season, which is, and I love the 8th season. It's one of my favorite seasons of the show. I am the X-Cast token 8th season defender here. But they look at that season, they say it looks kind of dry, it looks kind of humorless, it looks kind of self-serious. It's almost as if they took all the comedy that would have gone into the 6 or 7 seasons of the X-Files and just poured it into these 13 episodes. In a way that was maybe ill-advised, that maybe that sort of humor doesn't sustain an entire 40-minute episode. Maybe you can have 20 minutes of it and 20 minutes of drama. But I don't know if I agree with you that this wouldn't have happened, wouldn't have looked like this had it happened earlier in the show's run. I don't think it would have looked like this had it happened a year or two earlier. I don't think they would have been making the 6th or 7th season and then tried to make a comedy at the same time. I think they need to have decided to have like toned down the comedy in the X-Files to justify shunting it all over here.
That's a really good point, yeah. And I asked that question more openly in the sense of, I honestly don't know if they would have made a different show. It feels like they might have made a slightly different show, or maybe a show that was a little bit more consistent with the tone of either the pilot or All About Eve, which are probably the show at its most consistently even-handed, particularly the pilot. But we'll get to that in a second. But it's a really interesting question because I think timing is key. As you've described, as Vince Gilligan described, as to the success of this. But it had. We normally do the IMDb score per episode, obviously for the X-Cast.
You're not going to hammer me with like 13 of these in a row. Higher, lower.
Yeah, we should play your cards right and just try and guess.
Do I hold?
Strike it. Yeah. Yeah. I'll put on my best Bruce Forsyth voice, which will mean nothing to people in America. So sorry about that, guys. Anyway. No, it has an overall IMDb rating, thankfully. So I'm going to invite you to take a guess. 5,583 voters. Okay. So I'm going to invite you, Darren, to take a guess at what you think the Lone Gunmen's IMDb rating might be.
Okay, 5,000 is a fairly sizable pool of voters, so it's not going to be a small inflated pool of people who love the show. It's not going to be like the hardcore Lone Gunmen fans. As we've talked about, the show isn't really... It's not that it's spoken poorly of, it's just not spoken of at all, which means that I don't think it's going to be too high and I don't think it's going to be too low. I'm going to go with a 6.8.
That's not a bad guess. It actually is a little bit higher. Oh. The overall rating is 7.4 out of 10, actually. Okay. Which is a little bit higher than I honestly expected it might be, actually. And so is the vote share. I actually didn't think you'd have 5,000 people. I'm pretty sure that Millennium doesn't have anywhere near that number in terms of people who actually have voted on it. In fact, I'm just going to do a little double check.
I love the idea.
Actually,
okay, all right. I was about to say, I love the idea that like more people watched Lone Gunmen than watched Millennium, but like the Millennium people really got into it, and the Lone Gunmen people were just like, well, that's 13 hours, I guess.
Yeah, no, I take that back. Millennium has 11,000 voters. Okay. That's fine,
so twice as
and that's just as it should be. You know, I'm happy with that. But yeah, I think that's an interesting barometer of what overall quality of what people think. But let's maybe dig in then a little bit more now. Let's let's talk a little bit more specifically about some of the episodes. I think we obviously need to start with the pilot, naturally, because in many respects, Darren, I don't know if you agree, but I think the pilot, putting aside the quite controversial reason the pilot is memorable, which, we'll get to, I think it's probably the most important episode of this show, not just in terms of establishing the show, because a lot of people who are coming to the Lone Gunmen are probably going to know them fairly well from the X-Files, realistically. I can't imagine there are an enormous swathe of people coming to watch it, but actually maybe not, because the premiere number for viewers in millions, the Nielsen ratings, was 13 million, 0.23 when it aired, and then the finale was down to like 4.56, so it's a huge drop. People just tailed off.
Well, no, to be fair, the finale was 5.25, so it began to grow a little bit. It declined.
I take that back.
It ebbed and flowed. The issue is you're looking at the Captain Toby show numbers, and that aired in the finale, like. Just to put this in perspective of how clear it was that Fox did not care about this show, they aired All About Eve, which is a finale that ends with a cliffhanger in May 2001. So that's typically where you would have your end of season slot in May, right? And then ideally you pick it up and you renew it in June or whatever. You pick it up, you renew it, and it airs in September, October. But then, they had the Captain Toby show, which was an episode that they had filmed as part of the 13 order for the show. They'd been holding it back, presumably, for the second season. My gut feeling is that they'd been holding it back so that they could have a Lone Gunmen heavy episode on the X-Files. Again, this is one of the big logistical challenges if you're making a Lone Gunmen show, because the Lone Gunmen continue to appear in the X-Files while these three actors are starring in their own show. And in fact, you can tell, I think Diagnosis Jimmy is the one that overlaps with their appearance in 3 Words, which is the most Lone Gunmen heavy episode of the 8th season of the X-Files. And
Langley does crop up with blue paint, doesn't he? Is that the same one where he's got blue paint on his face?
That's in Nothing Important Happened Day Part 1. So that's in the immediate aftermath of this cliffhanger. It's after the show's been cancelled. But I do wonder if, they knew that they were going to lose Duchovny in the 9th season, and they're like, if we have a Lone Gunmen episode in the can, we can put them in the premiere of the next season, which is very optimistic, where it's like, look, we don't want to lose the second season of the Lone Gunmen, but we also don't want to lose them in the 9th season of the X-Files. But apparently, it's 1 month after they'd aired All About Eve, the cliffhanger that ends the first season, Fox were like, you know what, we cancelled the show, and this episode you were saving, we're just going to air it randomly in June. Yeah. So I think 4.56 million people watching an episode of a show that had ended its season 3 weeks earlier. Not the worst ratings you could have. No,
that's a really good bit of knowledge. I did not know that at all, but that makes sense. But in terms of the low number, but I mean that's terrible. But the point I was trying to make and going back over myself, I guess, was that I didn't think necessarily lots of people might be tuning into this pilot, not having not seen the X-Files, but maybe they did, and maybe that's why the pilot itself does, I think, attempt to toe that balance between humour, naturally, that level of comedy that you see with the Lone Gunmen, but a little bit of actual drama and pathos that you don't really get throughout the rest of the season, particularly with Baez and his dad. So, I mean, what do you think? Do you think the pilot is a successful statement of intent, really?
Don't know. I mean, I'm more likely to place the kind of tonal difference between the pilot and the season that followed at the feet of the director, Rob Bowman, who had directed Fight the Future, and the pilot looks and feels more cinematic. Even though it's shot in Vancouver, with much of the same cast and crew, it just feels more cinematic and more thrilling than the season that follows. And I mean no disrespect to any of the directors who follow, particularly Brian Spicer, who directed about half of the season and became the show's go-to director, and who appears on several of the commentaries, and by all accounts is an absolutely lovely guy, and I think he figures out how to do the show as best he can over the course of those episodes. But I think Bowman kind of arrives having literally directed the X-Files feature film, and he just gives that premiere a kind of a bombastic sense of kind of spectacle. It feels propulsive, it feels big, it feels ambitious, and again, part of that's the luxury of you're shooting a pilot. You have a larger budget, you have a looser schedule. You're filming it as a proof of concept, and you're putting everything into it in the hopes that the executives will green light it. Like even small things like that shot across the roof at the very start of the pilot looks more cinematic than almost anything in any of the episodes that follows. I don't know if I think this is particularly like thematically, tonally consistent. One of my big issues with the show, and if we're being kind and we're being generous to the show, this runs a total of 13 episodes, right? Anybody who watched network television in the 90s, or even today, setting aside prestige television, setting aside cable, those 20-odd episode seasons are very much like you learn by doing in terms of making television. They tend to be very rocky at the start because everybody involved is figuring out how to make a television show, but also how to make this particular television show. And if you look at, say, the first 13 episodes of The X-Files, like, I would not want The X-Files to be judged by those. I mean, obviously it contains ice and it contains Beyond the Sea. Beyond the Sea is, for me, one of the great television episodes ever. But it also includes, like, you know, the Jersey Devil, shadows, and space, Ghost in the Machine. There is a sense of, like, you are figuring out what the show is going to be. And I think the pilot is kind of a little bit confused in that sense, where this could be an X-Files episode. I think one of the big issues facing the show in its first couple of weeks is the challenge of going, well, what makes this different? What makes the Lone Gunmen different from the X-Files? How do you tell a story on this show that you couldn't just swap, you know, Mulder and Scully or Scully and Doggett into and effectively have the same narrative, even if the tone is slightly different? And I think the pilot feels a little bit like that. It feels almost like a cast-off X-Files episode. I can see a version of Mulder and Scully doing this. I mean, the Byers stuff is a great example of that, where the dad stuff, that's Mulder's stuff. That's Mulder's arc from the X-Files. Giving Byers daddy issues. It's not just the X-Files. It's obviously all of pop culture, specifically all of pop culture that's inflected by, like, 70s pop culture in particular, following kind of Star Wars and all that sort of stuff. But, like, it does feel, watching the pilot, like we're trying to do the X-Files. And sure, maybe it's a lighter, sillier version of the X-Files, but we're still kind of doing the X-Files. We're not yet doing the Lone Gunmen. And then, that said, as you pointed out, I think the pilot works well because everybody involved knows how to do an X-File. And I think...
Have you heard about the 2018 study that showed half of prenatal vitamins tested had unacceptable levels of heavy metals? No? Well, now you have. I'm Kat, mother of 3 and founder of Ritual, the company making traceability the new standard in the supplement industry. I remember staring at my prenatal vitamins and finding all these things I was trying to avoid. High amounts of heavy metals, synthetic colorants, and unnecessary ingredients. So, at 4 months pregnant, I quit my job and started Ritual because I believe that all women deserve to know what they're putting in their bodies and why. I'm so proud of our prenatal vitamin. The ingredients are 100% traceable, it's third-party tested for microbes and heavy metals, and recently received the Purity Award from the Clean Label Project. You see, we trace like a mother because, let's be honest, no one cares quite like a mother. But don't just take my word for it. Trace for yourself with 25% off at ritual.com/podcast.
If we're being diplomatic, I think the quality of the next run of episodes, which includes Bond, Jimmy Bond, Ein Klein Frohickey, Like Water for Octane, 3 Men in a Smoking Diaper, kind of suffers a little bit, just a tiny bit, almost imperceptibly, from the fact that, like, they've done the pilot, which feels like an X-Files episode, and now they're like, but what is a Lone Gunmen episode? And you're watching 4 episodes of them having no idea what the show is while churning out, like, 45 minutes of television. So I agree the pilot's very good. I don't know if I'd agree that it is what the Lone Gunmen should be.
Yeah, I think that's fair, really. I think it's for me, I'd say it's probably the best approximation of what they were trying to hopefully do at this point, but it's not necessarily an example of what the show is. They say this, don't they, on the commentary track for the pilot, actually. They talk about how well, for one thing, they say it doesn't look like the X-Files, which I'm not quite sure I agree with that, really, because that goes to your point. But It's also that they mention how they recognise that this is a bit X-File-y territory. As much as they'd said they didn't want the show to stray into the supernatural, as the X-Files had done. They didn't want to make it too dark and sinister as Millennium was, which is natural. It wouldn't be right if it was.
Jesus, can you imagine the version of the Lone Gunmen that gives you like episodes like Lamentation, Sacrament?
I would have loved the crossover with Lance Henriksen popping up in the Lone Gunmen. Can you imagine that? Frank Black and the Lone Gunmen would have been fun, I think. That surely has happened in one of those comics.
Yeah,
don't call me Frank. Yeah, it's Mr. Black. But so they talk about how they're trying to avoid that territory, and in the pilot they recognise that this is a little bit X-Files like with the government, and then they intentionally said they wanted to move away from that aspect of the show and go more into the kind of things they do, which are Alan Dale as a Nazi, or like things like.
I like the way that you say like into the things they more naturally do, as if like the next sentence you say is going to make any sense whatsoever, and you're like, no, it's beloved Jim from Neighbours, and he's playing a Nazi. It's like
and if we want to get X-Files canonical, technical on this, like he's both that Nazi and also the super soldier guy at the same time. And I was a bit like, but. No, I think they want to go into more of this conspiracy theory, slightly wacky territory, is what I'm getting at, and I think, but the it also fusing together that retro '60s aesthetic. I mean, that pilot has the intentional knockoff of Mission Impossible with Frohike on the from the first Mission Impossible movie, which as Vince Gilligan says, is absolutely a rip-off. They're fully aware of that.
That's what the show seems to be honing in on, is the fact that like the guys who worked on this, Gilligan, Shipan, Spotnitz, they love television. They love classic television. And again, this is one of those is it a show out of time things in like a more existential sense, a kind of a vaguer sense, where television at the turn of the millennium is getting more serialized, it's getting more experimental, it's getting more cinematic. You have the X-Files is like cinematic. The X-Files is this incredible cinematic TV show. 24 is coming up. That's going to be heavily serialized, and like the idea of episodic television arguably entering kind of a period of decline with the success of shows like, say, The Sopranos, which is the show that knocks The X-Files out of the Emmy Outstanding Drama category, for example. You have this idea that television is on the cusp of a revolution, and you watch The Lone Gunmen, and it is very clear that, like, Gilligan, Shiban, and Spotnitz are guys who grew up loving 60s and 70s television. You point the Mission Impossible stuff as a very obvious example. Things like the masks that pop out throughout. Things like the elaborate schemes and the fake-outs. Those are also, like, lifted directly there. You have, like, at one point in Maximum Buyers, they talk about how every television show does an episode where the characters go to prison while doing an episode where the characters go to prison. There's, like, in the finale, like, and again, on the commentary for All About Eve, they point this out. They point out the absurdity of this, but you have Kimmy the Geek makes a joke about like kung fu, and like Gilligan is watching this, and in 2001, let alone now, is asking, does anybody watching TV in 2001 even know what like kung fu is? Do they have any frame of reference for it? And even something like, say, the Cat and Toby show, which is the episode that was burnt afterwards, that was meant to be in the second season. That's an episode about television. It's an episode about loving television. It's an episode about like falling in love with children's television and kind of like modernizing it, and how television itself is changing and it's becoming something that is unrecognizable and alien to a bunch of geeks who grew up loving it. I think that's kind of an interesting, Diagnosis Jimmy, like that title is an allusion to a show that I don't know how many viewers watching in 2001, let alone 2023, will recognize. It is a show that's written with love. Like, it's written with love and affection for episodic, old-fashioned 60s and 70s television, but it's at a time where television is changing, and, like, how out of date must this have seemed if you were turning on television in 2001 and going, Sopranos, 24, X-Files, and then, oh, by the way, they've got masks and they can change their voices, and there's a sexy tango competition. You know?
It's a strange brew, isn't it, of a lot of different things. With Diagnosis, though, I mean, you're referring to Diagnosis Murder, I assume,
Yes.
with Dick Van Dyke. Now, I have to say, I did know what that was in 2001 because I was at university at the time, and a friend of, this is a random tangent, sorry,
No, go for it.
but a friend of mine was upset. We'd all alight to the pub after our lecture and stuff, as you do. But she was obsessed with being away way before the rest of us because she says, I cannot miss Diagnosis Murder. It is on at 3 p.m, right, on whatever it was, Channel 4. And she would go back to her halls of residence to watch Diagnosis. This is an 18-year-old girl, right? So, it clearly still had some level of cultural traction at the time.
What you're telling me is that it's going to be all over TikTok in the next couple of weeks. By the way, you're right.
I hope so.
Diagnosis Murder, appropriately enough, wrapped up its final season on May 11th, 2001. So in parallel with the Lone Gunmen. So I stand corrected. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh. It wrapped up the same day. The finale of Diagnosis Murder aired the same day as All About Eve. Wow.
Oh my God, that is a fact I never thought would come out in this discussion. That's amazing. But that's the thing, though. You're right. It is completely in the thrall of that 60s and that retro kind. I mean, Jimmy Bond. I mean, I know it's not a TV show, obviously, but Jimmy Bond being an obvious reference to James Bond, a consistent reference to James
Planet
Bond.
Planet of the Frohickeys, Planet of the Apes, that iconic 60s TV show. I mean, Diagnosis Jimmy, the episode we're mocking, is Rear Window, which is a 50s movie,
Yeah. That's the thing, when you're describing this as well, I feel a little bit of sadness in the sense that it actually has some good ideas. It does have some interesting ideas, like, the whole thing about, the Captain Toby show with Langley really loving this guy growing up and seeing how much this is changing around him and there being a scandal about this, lovable guy. There are some really interesting concepts, that the kind of stories that neither the X-Files nor Millennium would have been able to do, within the construct of their shows. And it's just a shame that in the way often that they are handled, it's a shame that, you've got some episodes that are just awful, like Ina Klein and Frohickey, like Three Men in a Smoking Diaper. There's very little going on there to really recommend.
And we should be clear, those are two of the first 3 episodes. Those are two of the first 5 episodes, right. To be clear.
Yeah, it gets a little better as you go on, a little, but there are some intriguing concepts. It just it never feels, though, like they really know how I mean, it is that classic season 1 syndrome, like you said earlier. They haven't figured out how to write this show, and a lot of the time it was, and it still is in many ways, even though the streaming era's changed things slightly with production, I guess. But you are finding your feet a lot in the first season, but these were the days when things were far more ruthless, in terms of cutting things off at the knees before they got a chance to start. I suppose the question that I think a lot of people have had is, even if you take the conspiratorial aspect out of that pilot, would it have actually been better off trying to have a little bit more of that balance in tone of what the pilot gave you, while still trying to tell some of these bouncier, wackier conspiratorial stories? Could it have even done it, Darren? I mean, that's the thing. Could they have even done these kind of tales that they did do in that kind of style? Well,
I mean, the thing for me with this show is that comedy is very difficult, Darren says, stating the absolute obvious. But there is a reason why, if you look at the history of American television, the default mode for comedy has been the half-hour sitcom with the canned laughter track. And the canned laughter track tells you when to laugh, which is like a great cheat code when it comes to comedy. It's like, if you have a joke and you're not sure whether it's going to land or not, put on the laugh track and you'll be able to fool a significant portion of the audience into thinking that was hilarious. This is a 45-minute show. A 45-minute comedy, which is an hour-long comedy when you add ads, is a challenging proposition, to put it mildly. It's very difficult to extend comedy that long. Now, obviously, there are exceptions, but by and large, if you think of the successful hour-long comedies that exist in the modern landscape, I'm thinking recently of, say, things like Girls, for example, or things like Succession. They tend to do that by balancing their comedy with drama, to the point where, I would feel more comfortable talking about Succession as a darkly comic drama than I would as a dramatic comedy, if that makes sense. Yeah. And I think, for me, the really awful, unbearable stuff in this first season is the stuff that is geared at being just a flat-out comedy. And like off the top of my head, and the thing is, it's not that the show makes a bad joke and then learns its lesson and stops making that bad joke. It's that it makes a bad joke and then makes it in every single episode, sometimes several times. So, it's a 90s TV show. It's a 90s TV show that wants to be a comedy. That means you're going to get a lot of homophobia. There's going to be a lot of jokes about how uncomfortable it would be for men to have sex with other men, and how hilarious it would be if our characters were confronted with that possibility, which, was groan-worthy in 2001, but has aged even worse now. There's this recurring joke about how Langley must be a girl because he has long hair, to the point where, like, it's a closing gag in several episodes, which is a strange choice. There's the idea that Frohickey falling down is inherently funny and silly, and it's like, that's a little bit funny, but I don't know if it's like the button you go to whenever you want something to work. There's like all sorts of poorly judged choices here, like Water for Octane has an extended sequence which thinks Langley putting his hand up the backside of a cow is hilarious.
Yeah.
It's just uncomfortable to watch.
All of the stuff with Frohickey and Ina Kleiner Frohickey, where he's trying to, where he pulls back the pants of that old lady, and it's all that kind of thing. Where I was just sitting there thinking, what on earth am I watching? Like, what is going on?
Yeah,
what are they doing?
It's like, this would be bad in a half-hour sitcom, but a half-hour sitcom is only half an hour long. This is an hour of this. It's like we've committed to this. We're leading into it.
Yeah. You talking about things as well that are slightly problematic. I do think it is very, very male gazy in terms of Zuleika Robinson and Eva Del Harlow. I mean, it is. I mean, they're slightly guilty of it on the commentary. They do a bit of leering over her in the pilot at one point when they're actually talking about the show. Talking about how hot she looks and things. But it's very much there from start to finish with Eve.
I mean, like,
and
Maximum
that
Buyers,
feels very dated now.
Maximum Buyers is a great example of that, where she plays the girlfriend and she's kind of dressed in this skimpy clothes, and it's meant to be hilarious, and like things like obviously the fact that she wears a cat suit, which is weird and impractical. Yeah, it's very bad. I mean, look, obviously there's the whole thing with the lying game, which is, to be clear, I think it's a very well-intentioned episode. I don't think it means it has any malice whatsoever, but it's an episode of a comedy series in 2001 dealing with transgenderism, which means that it feels very clumsy, and it kind of stumbles backwards into a number of kind of problematic tropes. But yeah, it's really odd. It's really distracting, and it doesn't. It's really for me. Like, if I'm gonna say something nice, I feel like we've been very mean about the Lone Gunmen today. I don't want to give the impression. I don't hate the show. I think it is better than Harsh Realm, which is great. That's That's something you can put on a poster. Put it on the DVD box set. Better than Harsh Realm! !
Not the highest of praise, but it's something.
Yeah. I think the show. We mentioned those 4 episodes following the pilot. Bond, Jimmy Bond, Ina Kleine Frohickey, Like Water for Octane, 3 Men in a Smoking Diaper, all of which are agony to watch. They were agony for me to watch when I was covering the show with long-form essays. They were agony for me to watch when I agreed to do this podcast. There was a point when I was halfway through Like Water for Octane, and I was like, can I just tell Tony that I'm sick? Like,
honestly, Darren, my wife kept repeatedly coming in and going, "Whoa, you're not still watching this shit, are you?" Genuinely. She said, "Why would you want to talk about this?" I said, "We've got to do it." I said, "It's on the Xcast.
The people demand it.
The people demand it. Damn it!" But she just found it staggeringly awful. But yeah. So she's with you on that.
What I will say is, I think that after those 4 episodes, the show kind of finds a keel. Now, to be clear, it loses that keel very, very quickly, and it's not like the show suddenly flicks a switch and becomes a masterpiece. But I think that when you get to, like, Madam, I Madam, Planet of the Frohickeys, and Tangle de los Pistoleros later in the season, the show kind of hones in on an approach that I think works. That feels like if you took those 3 episodes and made 13 of them, I think the show would, A, have a much stronger legacy than it does, and B, would be something that I would think of a lot more fondly, which is that it's kind of, again, this is the weird thing where everybody on the commentaries is like, man, how much do we love 3 of a Kind? 3 of a Kind is awesome. And it's like, no, No, Three of a Kind is okay as a diversion in the middle of a 20-odd episode season. The episode you want to be doing is Unusual Suspects, which is this story that is kind of funny, but also kind of sad, but also kind of pathetic and melancholy and weird and unusual. And the difference between the Lone Gunmen and the X-Files is the idea that, like, Mulder is the hero of his own story. He's the center figure in this gigantic conspiracy that involves the entire future of mankind, the fate of the world, all this sort of stuff. Whereas the Lone Gunmen are these three weirdos who exist on the margins, believing all this crazy stuff and never really accomplishing anything. And, like, I think that when you get to episodes like Madam, I'm Adam, Planet of the Frohickeys, and Tango de los Pistoleros, there's kind of an interesting melancholy to the show, where it taps into this sense of being about something in a grand sense, where it's like, I watch Bond, Jimmy Bond, Ein Klein Frohickey, Like Water for Octane, Three Men in a Smoking Diaper, and you go, Darren, what is the Lone Gunmen about? And I'm like, 45 minutes. About. It feels longer, but it's about 45 minutes. Whereas I watch Madam, I'm Adam, Planet of the Frohickeys, and Tango de los Pistoleros, and you ask me, what is the Lone Gunmen about? And I'm like, well, it's about crushing existential loneliness. It's about the idea that we are all disenfranchised little weirdos living our quiet little lives, hoping to find some form of connection in a universe that is inherently hostile to it. And that, it kind of, those episodes for me are where the show figures out what it wants to do. It becomes these stories of weirdos and, quote unquote freaks. There's a point where, like, I think it's in The Lying Game where Byers says, look, people look at us like we're the National Enquirer. Where, like, in those episodes feel like they're about National Enquirer stories that become these weird melancholy character studies. Where obviously you have, Madam, I'm Adam, you have the story of the guy who believes his life has been stolen because he's been subject to, like, government brainwashing. I think, like, the influence on that is A Clockwork Orange. And he has to decide whether or not he wants to live an imaginary life where he's happy or he wants to go out into a messy world and be with the woman that he loves. And those...
Played by Stephen Tobolowsky as well.
Yes.
Very good actor.
And those feels like the right stakes. You have Planet of the Frohickeys, which is this wonderful, like, insane plot where a self-aware monkey basically manipulates our three lovable idiots into believing that there is a conspiracy to assassinate the president of France using a cat operative, like an animal operative, when what he's really doing is just trying to get himself transferred to a zoo so he can be with a chimpanzee that he loves. Yeah, sorry.
With the voice of Edward Woodward, let's not forget as well.
The Equalizer, from The Equalizer. Again, like, that's how much the show is rooted in classic television. It's like, it's not Edward Woodward, like, veteran of stage and screen. No, it's Edward Woodward from The Equalizer.
From The Equalizer.
But, like, he has that wonderful quote which sums up, like, for me, it's the moment where I'm kind of like, I get what this show is, which is, like, all the world is a cage if you have to live in it alone. And the idea is that these lone gunmen are these weirdos who have to live alone together. And then, like, Tango de los Pistoleros, which is, again, trying to create Miami and Vancouver, which is one of the show's most ambitious conceits. But you have this idea of, tango dancing, an arms deal at a tango competition, which ends up becoming this really sweet, sad story about, like, wanting to connect with somebody, where Eve kind of ends up falling in love with this guy who's part of a weapons deal, who, in the last minute, even knowing that she betrayed him, chooses to sacrifice his life to save her.
Gives his life. Yeah.
And like, it's sad, and it's lonely, and it's weird, and it's unusual, and it has, like, again, this sense of this kind of X-Files adjacent idea of a culture that exists below our own, where, obviously, Madam, I'm Adam, you're in the weird space of, like, little person wrestling, used car salesman, and brainwashing. In Planet of the Frohickeys, you're in, like, animal hyper-intelligence testing. In Tango de los Pistoleros, you have the idea of Frohickey, who had this entire separate life on the Miami tango circuit. But you have this idea that in these little enclosed spaces, people are all fundamentally alone. It's that Darren Morgan thing. That idea in Jose Chung's From Outer Space, which is, we may not be alone in the universe, but many of us are alone down here. And I think, like, that, for me, is when the show like really comes close to working, is when it figures out that like what differentiates it from the X-Files is the idea that these guys don't have a cigarette. Their cigarette smoking man is Morris Fletcher, who is like a loser who like uses his like involvement in government conspiracy to try and sleep with women at bars, often failing to do that. Like that's their arch nemesis. That's the level at which they operate. That is their foil. This mid-level bureaucrat who is in an unhappy marriage, and the idea that like, they don't get the catharsis that Mulder does of like vanquishing the cigarette smoking man, of reconciling with his father, of stopping colonization. They just kind of wander through the world and try to make sense of it all. And like I do, to give the show some credit, I think Madam I'm Adam, Planet of the Frohickeys, and Tango de los Pistoleros are the shows that I look at and go, I could tune in weekly to see this. And in fact, part of me, it reminds me a lot of, is it Bored to Death? Is that the show that I'm thinking of with Ted Danson and Jason Schwartzman?
Oh, I don't know that one.
Okay, nobody knows that one. It's fine. It was the HBO show about the writer of murder mysteries. It was the existential murder mystery kind of thing. It's like the holistic detective agency kind of thing. It was on from 2009 to 2011, and it was it was Zach Galifianakis was there as well.
Oh wow, yeah, wow, okay. I think you're right. I think that that's what I said earlier about how the fact it's disappointing because it's grasping at something, isn't it? It's trying to find something that it means, that it's about, and it almost gets there in some of these episodes. I absolutely agree, and I think it doesn't quite make it. It doesn't quite do it. Are you familiar with the argument that's been made when you're talking about some of these, these ideas and these potential character ideas? What do you make of the argument that the presence of probably particularly Jimmy, but also Eve, sort of relegates the gunmen a little bit within their own show at points? Do you subscribe to the idea that maybe those two characters have a little bit too much to do here, or do they bring to it a different sensibility that helps it distinguish itself in a way?
They feel like walking network notes, and I mean, and to be fair, I think like by all accounts, Stephen Stedden and Zuleika Robinson are fantastic actors. Everybody got along perfectly on set. The writers have nothing but nice things to say about them, perhaps inappropriately nice things to say in some cases, as you point out in the commentary. And I think they said that like the issue with one of the reasons they created Jimmy Bond was just like pure mechanics, where they needed somebody to whom the lone gunman could exposit in order for the audience to follow along. Because they found when they wrote the pilot, there were a lot of scenes of the lone gunman telling each other things they would already know. But it really does feel like they went into Fox with a pitch and they're like, okay, we have our pitch. It's going to be about 3 hackers and we've already cast them. Here are their photos. And they put up photos of Dean Hagland, Tom Braidwood, and Bruce Harwood, who are, like, I love them all very, very much, but no studio executive is going to go, yeah, that's a bankable, like Bruce Harwood, we're going to have a hot Harwood summer is what we're going to have here, baby.
True.
But it really does feel like they added Harlow in part because, the stereotype of you have to have the girl. It's the Pink Ranger. You have to have, like, one member of this ensemble has to be a woman, so that, as you said, the show can be very creepily male-gazy towards her. And then Jimmy Bond feels like he's there because it's like, well, we don't want people to think this is a show for nerds. So what if we have, like, somebody who's not a nerd, and he knows about football? Like, one of Jimmy Bond's, like, defining character traits is that he likes football. That is how much of a network note of a character he seems. Like, it's like, I like the idea of blind football. It's a nice gag. Jimmy Bond maybe overplays it just a little bit, but it's like the lying game, which is this, again, one of the big structural issues with the season. There are far too many episodes that for some reason are narrated by Jimmy, in large part because it feels like the writers couldn't figure out anything for Jimmy to do apart from narrate these episodes. But like the lying game is like he uses a football metaphor throughout. And I'm like, what purpose does this serve? Like, do you think that anybody watching this show is going to be like, well, it's about nerds and computers, but the dude's talking about football, so I guess I'll stick along. I guess I'll follow it. Now I can relate to it.
I think you're right. I mean, they fall into stock cliches, don't they? In many ways, the like you say, the dim but lovable football player who can do a little bit maybe of some of the action stuff sometimes as well. The hot girl who is objectified, who is mysterious, who, I mean, at least we didn't get Frohickey pouring all over her all the time like he does with Scully. I mean, that's a say, because I did think that might happen quite a lot in this show, but it doesn't. They don't necessarily do that as characters, but the show definitely does that, really, all the way through. So they do fall into those stereotypes quite readily, really. And I think you're right. I think it is because how do they really sell these three quirky looking guys who are never going to be able, they're not series leads in any other continuity. Then you're never going to give them their own show. You know, they are very unconventional in that sense. So I see why.
Say what you will about like the show, and we absolutely have. Like, it's hard not to love a show that can give Tom Braidwood his kind of like Matrix moment at the start of Bond, Jimmy Bond. Like, I honestly, like, that was a moment where I was like, maybe this isn't going to be as bad as I remember it being on rewatch. And then it was like, no. Like, that's... No, it is. one of the big issues with the show is that, like, it's another one of those... 45 minutes is a long time in television. But it's like, there's an episode, I'm trying to remember which one. Is it Maximum Buyers? The one that opens with them finding Elvis. And I'm like, this would be the perfect Lone Gunmen short. If you just chop that 5 minutes off and put it on the internet now, that would be just like perfect, like a little minisode to bridge seasons, or a little X-Files bonus for people. You know, the 3 Lone Gunmen find Elvis. But instead, it's stitched onto the start of Maximum Buyers, which is an episode of television that I do not remember anything about.
It's true, actually. Maybe it would have worked better in that kind of minisode structure, really, in having that. I did also think, would this, and I know they wouldn't have done it in this way then, or in the same context, but would this kind of thing work better as an animated series? You know, along the lines of something like, you know, your Star Trek Lower Decks kind of thing. Yeah. Or Archer, Archer, exactly. And I suppose, you know, that's potentially what they were thinking with this, the aborted Albuquerque X-Files show. But, you know, in a weird way, I could see it working better if you'd have had these guys come in and do the voices, have these characters animated. And I think you would have gotten away with a lot more of this wacky kind of comedy, actually. I think it would have worked. I think we're doing it live action. It doesn't, for all the reasons we've said, it doesn't click. It doesn't make sense.
It would have worked like the Clerks animated TV show, which was around the same time, which is one of those curiosities of television. And again, the Clerks TV show is something that exists in that same space where it's a love letter to television. Again, I don't know how many people are familiar with Clerks, the animated series. It only produced 6 episodes, so maybe this wouldn't have been the format for the Lone Gunmen. But like the second episode of that show is a clip show, which means that all the clips from that episode come from the first episode and the bits you have already seen of the second episode, which is one of those kind of like crazy high concepts where it's like, I love this, but I cannot imagine any universe where you thought you were going to get to do more than 6 episodes of it.
So, guys, as we were recording this, I very quickly realised that this was a 2-parter. So, we're going to pause the conversation there after an hour, and we've got another hour to come where we dig more into the finale, all about Eve, a little bit on Jump the Shark, which we're going to cover in more detail in a couple of weeks as a main episode of the Xcast, and our Season 9 coverage. And also a load of really, really interesting listener feedback, which we get into and really dig into for quite a while, because turns out lots of people have opinions on the Lone Gunmen TV show, so that's going to be a lot of fun to explore. So we're going to put a pin in this discussion. Please come back next time for part 2, but thanks for listening as always, and remember, trust no one.